Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccer Nostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview Mr. Runar Nordvik. Mr. Nordvik is the head of media at Norwegian club FK Haugesund and a former football journalist. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on the historical Norway versus England World Cup qualifier on September 9, 1981, looked from a Norwegian perspective. Hello, Mr. Norvik. Thank you for this interview.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, I'm currently working as the head of media at FK Haugesund. Been doing so for 7 years, but I started out like everyone else with just a huge passion for football. From whenever I was very small, always been very interested in both domestic football and football abroad from all over the world. And it developed into a career as a football journalist, football writer, and been working especially covering the football in the Balkans, southern Eastern European part of Europe, the former Yugoslavia, for many years, which is sort of my speciality, to put it that way. And it was also in many ways an introduction to be working as the head of media at FK Haugesund, where I'm right now.
Yes. Now, can you describe the state of affairs in Norwegian football in the early 1980s?
Um, State of affairs in Norwegian football back in the early 80s was um, the conditions was very simple, to put it that way. There was on paper no professional footballers in Norway. I think most players still played full time, but through some dodgy agreements around. There was not that much money involved. There was infrastructure was quite simple. The national team wasn't very good. We had very few players playing abroad. So it was towards the end of a period where Norwegian football and the Norwegian national team was an easy victim wherever we traveled. We never qualified for any tournaments, and we weren't really close either. We had a few players that stood out at the time, earning their money abroad, but by far from enough to be a decent national team. And the step of leaving Norwegian football to get a contract outside of Norway turned impossible for most players, even on the national team at the time. And the only sort of success we had achieved at this point was qualifying for the Olympic tournament in Moscow in the 1980, when we beat an amateur German team in the final and decisive game. This was against a team of Germans who played at the lower level, so we shouldn't overestimate the achievement. But the actual tournament, like many other countries, we turned out to boycott the entire Olympic Games, so we never took part. But that was the only sort of success we could celebrate at the time from my childhood. Otherwise, we tend to travel around Europe and got beat more or less all the time. And the most important thing at the time was when we occasionally beat Sweden. That was and it still is very important, of course, because it's our neighboring country. And as long as we did that, even though Sweden was a much better team at the time, we still managed to beat them on quite a few occasions. That was pretty much the achievements of the national team summed up at the time. It was it was run by amateurs, and the results uh, was as expected when more or less everything concerning the Norwegian national team and football in general was run at the amateur level.
Now, can you explain the fascination in Norway about English football in these decades?
Um, it's hard. I think it's quite hard to understand for people living outside of Norway how passionate Norwegians were and still are about English football. The main reason was that in the late 60s, Norway, together with Sweden, started showing English football each Saturday on Norwegian television. This was at a time when Norwegian football wasn't shown on television. So it turned out to be the only football you could see on television. So everyone was watching it. At this point, at this stage, back in the 60s, there was only one TV channel, and everyone watched it. It was match of the day, sort of, and everyone watched it, and everyone very soon found their favorite teams. So you very soon developed a country of very passionate English club supporters in Norway, which still remains until this day. It has sort of nuanced a bit these days. You can get football from everywhere in the world, of course, on television. And some are focusing more on Italy or Germany or football in general. But English football is by far the most dominant football. If you're looking at football played outside of Norway, Norwegian football has developed and grown immensely in terms of interest, but the passion for English football in Norway is still huge, and a lot of Norwegians travel each weekend to England to watch games, and when people get children, they heritage their father's team, and so you can still see kids running around in well, mainly the most dominant clubs, of course, and at some point later on in the 90s, and there was suddenly a lot of Norwegian players playing in England, which of course only made the interest bigger. But the interest originally started at a point where there was no Norwegians nowhere near English football. It was mainly teams from the Midlands playing, like Aston Villa, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, in the early years, and but later on you could watch English football from all over England each Saturday on Norwegian television. So the interest was huge and still remains huge in Norway.
Yeah. Now, do you feel that in these post-war decades, the Norwegian players and the general expectations were hampered by the part-timer mentality in the Norwegian game?
Definitely, most definitely. I think there was some sort of reconciliation in Norway that we weren't supposed to be very good at football. We weren't supposed to qualify for major tournaments. We could make a small upset. We could, for instance, I remember us beating Switzerland in one game one year when I was very young, and everyone considered it a huge success, but it was the odd result out. Usually we would lose more or less every game, and um, so the era from post-war until from beyond 1980 and this specific game, it was I think there was some, I think people just accepted that the current way of Norwegian football shouldn't and wasn't capable of qualifying for major tournaments. So I remember when I grew up, me and my friends, we always said that we're never going to see a Norwegian team in a major tournament. You didn't dare thinking about it, and uh, never, and not to speak of the current situation where we have what is possibly one of the best players in the world alongside Martin Ødegaard and a few others. So we were at a completely different place back then, which is hard to imagine now. But we were really not in a good shape or a good state compared to other teams, not even our neighbors. Both Denmark and Sweden was much better than us. The only team we sort of could compete with was Finland. They were probably even worse off. So not that it mattered, but we weren't supposed to be good at football, and everyone accepted it. And people focused on winter sports and results. And up until this, should be mentioned that prior to this game in 1981, which we are going to talk about, we played England at Wembley earlier on in the qualification, and we lost 4-0, and we was wiped off the field. And everyone who went to that game, the players, everyone from the federation went there as tourists and took a lot of pictures. And it says it's all about the current state of affairs at the time in Norwegian football. It was really far from professional.
Yes. So let's get to this game in 1981. So at this point, England and Norway are in a World Cup qualifying group for the World Cup in Spain in 1982, along with Hungary, Romania, and Switzerland. Now, Hungary at this point seemed set to qualify, with England rivaling Romania for the second spot. And this particular game with Norway was England's penultimate match, and with a win, they they would have appeared set to have qualified. So they just needed a win, and ahead of time, I'm sure they must have thought it was a formality, given all the reasons you just went through. So this match on September 9, 1981, at Oslo's Ullevål Stadium. So let's take a look at the lineups. So Norway were managed by Tor Rostefosse. So in goal, we have Tor Antonsen of Hamar Kameraten, Bjørn Bertsen of Viking, Einar Jan As of Nottingham Forest in England, Ag Hareid of Molde, Svein Grondalen of Moss, Anders Jysk of Brann, Roger Albertson of Winterslag in Belgium, captain of the team Halvard Thorsen of PSV Eindhoven in Holland, Arne Larsen Oakland of Bayer Leverkusen in West Germany. He'd be replaced by Trond Pedersen of Start in the 87th minute, Pal Jakobsen of Vålerenga, Tom Lund of Lillestrøm, and he'd be replaced by Arne Daken of Panathinaikos in Greece in the 76th minute. So for England, managed by Ron Greenwood, we have the following lineup. In goal, Ray Clements of Tottenham, Phil Neal of Liverpool, Mick Mills of Ipswich, Russell Osman of Ipswich, Phil Thompson of Liverpool, Brian Robson of West Bromwich Albion. He was just about to join Manchester United when this match was played. Captain of the team, Kevin Keegan of Southampton, Terry McDermott of Liverpool, Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham. He'd be replaced by Peter Barnes of Leeds in the 63rd minute, Trevor Francis of Manchester City, Paul Marin of Ipswich, and he'd be replaced by Peter Witt of Aston Villa in the 78th minute. So predictably, England took the lead in the 15th minute when Mariner crossed from the left, and this was headed across by Keegan towards Robson, and he just went through, dribbled past Antonsen, and gave England the lead. And all the neutrals probably expected an avalanche of goals after this. But Norway would get back into the game.
Yeah, I think as I remember this, it was uh, at a night where they actually interrupted the transmission from Ullevål because they were going to show the news of the day. Nothing could compete with the news of the day at half the hour. So in the 30th minute, um, they left the game and they started this news show on Norwegian television, which everyone was watching every day,
Right.
called Dagsrevyen. It's the equivalent to news of the day, or um, and then after only a few minutes, I remember the guy reading the news said something that we have to go back to Ullevål because there has happened stuff. And
Oh,
then Norway had equalized. Um, and it should also be said that during the first 30 minutes, the Norwegian teams looked better than they had done for a long time. So you could sort of sense that this wasn't impossible. There was, even though England had taken the lead, there was something. I remember a few of those players you mentioned in the Norwegian team really looking at their best on the day. We're gonna go through some of them afterwards. So when they had to go back to Ullevål and they showed the goal and there was an equalizer, and you could sort of sense that it was this was could be one night for the history books in Norway. And after the goal, they went back to the news desk at the news of the day. So they started with other news, and then just before halftime, at the 45 minute, the news announcer, he said once more, and there's been further development at Ullevål, so we have to go back once more. And that's when Halvard Thoresen had put us up front with his 2-1 goal. So that's how I remember those goals. We didn't watch them directly. I think many Norwegians, when they talk about the game, they say that I remember watching it directly on television, but actually they didn't, because it was, they had probably seen it afterwards. It was actually just a part, short sequences within a news of the day transmission, which lasted for half an hour. So uh, when the news of the day was done, after half an hour, they went back and showed the full second half directly on television, which at the point Norwegian were 2-1 up. So that's how I remember it. I remember watching it at the telly together with my family. I was watching it in the living room, and the news, you could tell on the face of the news announcer that there was no doubt that Norway had scored, because he couldn't restrict or control himself. So that's a part of the broadcasting of the game which a lot of people has forgotten about.
yeah.
But that's actually how it occurred.
Yeah. That in itself is more interesting. That the
Yeah.
game was, interrupted for the news. Yeah. But yeah, so let's describe this tying goal in the 35th minute. So uh, Lund takes a corner kick from the right side, and this was punched out by Ray Clements. So Thorsen retrieves it and immediately passes back to Lund on the right side. So then Lund crosses, and this is something, it's unclear whether it directly goes into the net, or if Albertson makes a touch. What is the true real story on that?
Even up until this day, no one really knows, because Roger Albertsen, who unfortunately died not very long after retiring from football, he has always claimed that he managed to touch the ball. So he has always claimed himself as the goal scorer. When you look at the TV pictures, it doesn't look like he's touching it. And I think most people considers it the goal of Tom Lund. but officially, I think still Roger Albertsen has been credited with the goal, but I somewhat doubt that he actually touched it. He might think he touched it, but according to the TV pictures, it doesn't look like he did. So so it was it was the kind of goal that Norway had to score to actually score against this English team, which when you name drop them, it's hard to imagine how we managed to beat them because all of those players at the time were world class players. It was a really good team from England coming. They didn't rest any of their significant players. They just came here with their the best lineup they could possibly get, and so it wasn't a pretty goal, but it was still a goal, and it made the character of the game change because, as I already mentioned, during the first half, you could sort of tell that Norway was sort of up to the task on the day. And I think also the English players sensed that quite early on that this was something very different compared to the experience they had at Wembley the year prior when they won 4-0 convincingly. So when the equalizer came, I think that sort of stressed both the English players and the staff on the sideline because they could sort of sense this is not going to be a walk in the park. We are this Norwegian team is far better than they were last time we played them.
Right. And they would take the lead just before halftime in the 41st minute. And again, it was from an action from the right side. So Larson Oakland cross from the right side. I think Terry McDermott attempts to clear it, but he accidentally diverts it in the path of Halvard Thorsen, who just turned and quickly shot. And
Yeah,
that was the eventual winning goal.
yeah, and I remember just goal going in underneath Ray Clements, who tried to save it, but it was impossible, more or less impossible, because should be said that Halvard Thoresen, the captain and the goal scorer, he was one of very few players at the time playing abroad. He was also European top class. He was really the outstanding player in this team. Widely regarded even in Holland as one of the best players in the Dutch league. Not the typical goal scorer. Didn't score that many goals on the national team. Never any goals that could compare to this one, either before or later on in his career. But he was. But he's of course he would have been famous anyway. But this goal has made him special. Of course, ever since. So sort of justice has been done, leaving him with the match-winning goal because he was really a great player who unfortunately played at the national team at the time when he knew that he would spill his beans. Sort of, he would never achieve anything with the national team, and he never did. Uh, so this victory, for instance, among a few others later on, was the highlight of his international career with the national team. Back home in the Netherlands, when he played for Twente and PSV Eindhoven, he would win a lot of stuff. But he knew very well that he would never achieve anything in terms of international football with the national team. So afterwards, looking back, I find. And I met Halvard Thoresen on quite a few occasions afterwards, and he always speaks very profoundly of this experience and his goal and everything surrounding it. And we could talk a little bit more afterwards what this sort of victory would turn into, because it was far more than just one single victory. We can say in retrospect.
Can you tell me where you were when you watched this match? And as young as you were you able to understand its significance?
Yeah, I think so. I think I remember watching it back home in the living room with my family. just like we always watch football. My father sitting in a big chair behind me. This was the exact same way that we watched football every Saturday from England. Me sitting on the floor in front of the television. My brother was sitting in a chair, and my mother was sitting in a chair, and it was just in every household, the entire family was watching the game the same way. Um, and yeah, I think everyone knew, because we weren't spoiled with victories in general, and not of this kind of format. So for us, beating England with the tremendous support and respect Norwegians had for English football at the time, I think there was quite a few Norwegians who found it somewhat rude that we should beat England. It was disrespectful for these players, and it was a deserved win. Just to point that out, it was. I've seen the match in its entire match on a few occasions afterwards, and it was we won fair and square and deserved the win based on the performance on the night. But it was. Still, I think a lot of Norwegian always felt like they lost, because at the time many people would think, and I think even in England, they started worrying about the possibility of missing out on the World Cup due to this loss. They needed a win. It was 2 points at the time, so
Yeah,
they
they
needed.
had to. They had to. Their last match was in November at Wembley. They had to defeat Hungary, who had already
Yeah,
qualified. So that was
and
a
also
decisive match. Yeah.
I remember people speaking about the huge consequences for England, which also was the reason why the manager at the time, the national coach Ron Greenwood, uh, put out his best team, because they needed this win to be on track for World Cup qualification. So when they didn't win, and I think a lot of Norwegians thought that we had because we knew that we were not going to qualify, but making sure that England, which is the second team for most Norwegians, didn't qualify either was sort of sad. But I remember the kids who grew up, we would speak about this victory for days afterwards in school. That everyone spoke about this victory, and it will also be sort of a kickstart for for Norwegian football in many ways, because when you look at the lineup, you would see that most or at least half of the team was domestically based players. And shortly after, I think there was only a few weeks after this game, Åge Hareide would leave for an English club, Manchester City, for instance. And later on, most not only those players, but other players would start going abroad, and it would raise the level. So with this win would actually kickstart quite a lot in Norwegian football, and would still take about 10 years until we got to a level where we were a team that you could consider qualifying for major tournaments. But this win made a huge impact on Norwegian football, also in terms of how people started behaving within their own clubs, and all of a sudden everything was possible, because at the time England wasn't uh, probably wasn't the best team in the world, but in Norway we will always consider England the best team in the world, sort of. So when we beat them, we started thinking we can actually beat everyone. I mean, turned out that 10 years later we would beat Brazil on 3 times in a row when we faced them. And so it started changing the mindset of both fans and players and people working within football and everything. So it was it was a historical night, a special night, and a night football night of huge importance for Norwegian football.
And this match has also been immortalized because of the famous commentary by Björg Lillenlind on Norwegian television. And uh, and let me ask you, the famous, we are the best in the world, Lord Nelson, Sir Winston Churchill, and the whole line. And so, why do you think this has entered football folklore? Can you talk more about this famous quote?
Yeah, I think this quote, it was voted the best phrase ever coming from a sports commentator ever in football 10 years ago or something like that. And it just the same night as it was as Bjørge Lillelind said those famous words post match, it started becoming well known in Sweden and Denmark, and everyone didn't only show the pictures of the game, but they also added the Norwegian commentary and translated it. And in England, everyone started picking up on it. And right. So those lines just added extra spice to the entire occasion, and also the myth afterwards, because those lines stands out today as a historical moment in terms of sports commentating. And should be added that Bjørge Lillelind, he was actually for a very long time the only journalist working specifically and genuinely with sports at the national broadcaster. And he was working with a lot of different sports. He did winter sports and a lot of sports for radio. But he has a lot of other famous quotes, but not that has reached the level of this famous quote from that actual game abroad. Back home in Norway, is famous for being a sort of a loose cannon. He said whatever struck his head at the time, so he could come up with the silliest and dumbest things, and often the broadcaster had to retract, and they had to. It was always some sort of aftermath after he had been live on radio, because he could come up with the craziest things. So there was a lot of apologies by the broadcaster after he had been on work. But he was also a very cunning man in terms of football, should be noted. He was really he knew his stuff. He worked extremely close on every team and knew all the players, and had been traveling around in Europe for many years and watched football at high level. So he was a very good commentator. And everyone in Norway, you have this word of saying, which was actually quite true, that he was commentating on radio. You didn't commentate on television. So people would turn off the sound on television and have the radio on instead, while watching live pictures on television, because he was commentating on another level compared to everyone else. And I think the reason why he did that, because he was first and foremost a supporter of football and Norway, and he was speaking in a manner that a supporter would have spoken if he had the chance watching the game. And instead of those more formal analytical commentators. So he was hugely popular, and also as somewhat controversial throughout his entire career as a sports commentator. And unfortunately, he died quite young, when he was 60 years or something like that, 5 or 6 years after the game at Ullevål. But those lines, he has been Also he became immortal afterwards, and you can still hear a lot of Englishmen when you meet Englishmen today. They would they would start rephrasing those famous lines and everything. So I think they remember that probably more than the actual game many years afterwards.
Yeah. So let's discuss the players present that day and their subsequent trajectories.
I think we should start with the goalkeeper Tore Antonsen, because as I mentioned at the time, people weren't playing professionally, and he wasn't. He was an amateur in every sense of the word. And as, as far as I remember, he wasn't either the first choice or the second choice, hardly the third choice on the national team at the time.
Right.
And he didn't get that many appearances on the
No,
national
like eight matches in like 8 years or something.
Yeah, he was quite I think he was considered probably the fifth or sixth best goalkeeper in Norway, but it turns out at the time that he was the only one available prior to this game, for reasons I can't really remember, but we had better keepers at the time. But he was 100% an amateur player, because straight after this game, which is another part of the sort of folklore or the myth and everything concerning this game, he had to drive back home to Hamar, where he was living, because the very next day he had to stay and get up and get to work at 8 o'clock as a plumber. Wow. So that's how we spent the day after beating England. He was working as a plumber. So he was, this is actually the most famous game, of course. I think most people, if you ask them today to name the team, most people would forget that he was actually the goalkeeper at the time, because he wasn't an influential player in Norwegian football, and he didn't play that many matches. And but he became famous sort of simply due to this game. I can't really remember him as that much as from the club football, even though we played for Hamar Kameratene for many years. So I think he was a one club man and an honest goalkeeper, but and at international level he never stood out in any way except for taking part in this game. Other players we should mention that you have already mentioned it sort of, but Einar Jan Aas, he was the first Norwegian playing in England. He played for Nottingham Forest, had been there for a year or something at this point, but started out in Bayern München. He made that huge step from Moss to Germany, and then further on to England. And he was very good. He was a very good player, but unfortunately he injured himself shortly after this game in a match with the Nottingham Forest in England, and he never came back. So he I think it was only a few weeks or months after this game, his career was more or less over due to that injury he picked up with Nottingham Forest. And you also mentioned that Åge Hareide, he was I'm not exactly sure if this was the decisive game sort of, but Åge Hareide would leave Norwegian football and sign for Manchester City only a few weeks after this game. We played England on September the 9th, and I think Åge Hareide had signed before October for Manchester City. And he wasn't a huge success there, but he made a name of himself in Norwich for a couple of seasons before coming back to Norway, and he has turned into one of the best coaches ever in Norwegian football, and also not only being the national head coach of Denmark, but also for Norway and a lot of clubs throughout Scandinavia. He also deserves a mention. And we should also should be added that the first goal scorer, Roger Albertsen, who is famous for this. Did he score? Did he not score? He comes from he came from the western part of Norway, from a very small place within the fjords, at a place where I've driven past this place, Tyssedal, on many occasions, and I always wondered how it's possible to become a footballer at that place. But he was he is probably one of the most underrated players ever in Norwegian football. He was 17 years or something like that when he left this small place in Norway, went to Holland, and got a contract at a good Dutch club at the time. And he is later on he would be considered Red Roger, because he was playing. He was a hard man, and everyone considered him a hard man, which sort of overshadows his qualities as a player, because he was also a very good player, but he's first and foremost remembered as a hard man. So he had, I think his mentality was something out of the extraordinary, because when he went to Holland to get a contract, he had made his mind up on the first training session. He would tackle the biggest star at the club at the time, just to put himself into respect. And he was 17-year-old coming from Norway, didn't know a word of Dutch, of course, and hardly spoke English. And he just slaughtered their main star and captain on the first training session, and started growing from there. He got a contract and he went to Feyenoord, and he played for Olympiacos. But is first and foremost considered a hard man. But he was also a very good player, and but he has never been recognized for it. And he was the sort of player that always would rise to the occasion. I remember Norway playing in Germany in a friendly a year later, and he was this star man out on the field at the time. He was terrific, playing the best players. He always raised his level. Roger Albertsen, I'm very fond of him. Unfortunately, as I said, he died shortly after retiring due to cancer, unfortunately. So we will never get his final say on the whether he actually scored or not. Also mentioned Halvard Thoresen. He was the only player at top international level. And we had this other striker called Arne Larsen Økland, who was playing at Bayer Leverkusen at the time in Germany. He was a very decent striker. Deserves a mention because he also comes from the western part where I'm currently living. And also made a great career for himself in professional football afterwards. And we should definitely mention Tom Lund, the guy who I think actually scored the first goal. He never played abroad. If you ask most Norwegians living in the 70s and 80s, who's the best player ever in Norway, a lot of people would say Tom Lund. He was at an exceptionally high level. Unfortunately, he was afraid of flying, so he turned down all offers coming from abroad. At some point,
including Ajax. Yeah, I was going to say.
Ajax.
Yeah.
At some point, Ajax wanted him to replace Johan Cruyff when they sold Johan Cruyff to Barcelona. So they tried to sign Tom Lund, but he was very homebound first and foremost, and he was also afraid of flying. So he remained at Lillestrøm in Norwegian football, and he was playing at a completely different level compared to everyone else. I'm not sure how he managed it, but he was his talent was something out of the extraordinary. And I think actually he was the actual goal scorer in this game, but officially I think Roger Albertsen was credited with the goal. So I think those players probably have the most interesting stories. A lot of these players would also, the other players, Anders Giske would later go on and play in Germany, and but some of these guys remained in Norwegian football their entire career, like Paul Jacobsen and Svein Grøndalen or Bjarne Berntsen. All of these guys, they never left Norway.
As far as the Norwegian manager, Tor Rast Fosen, he did not succeed in his time with the national team for many of the reasons you've mentioned. And he left his post in 1987 after nearly a decade in charge. How is he viewed by Norwegian football historians?
Um, I think most people considered him football coach that wasn't tactically very clever. He was good on how to put it, working with players one-on-one, getting a good chemistry, getting good relations with the players and that kind of stuff. But football-wise, I think he had his shortcomings. I think he's considered a coach that had his shortcomings. So he tried. Well, he after he left his post as the national head coach, he picked up a few jobs in club football. He was never offered the best jobs in Norwegian football, the top clubs, for instance, because I don't think he was considered the best among the best coaches in Norway at the time, which he probably wasn't either. But he was a very likable fellow. He was good with media. He was good, as I said, in terms of getting players together and making it an enjoyable sort of experience being part of the Norwegian national team, even the team was struggling a bit. But he was not the sort of coach that would take Norway to tournaments, which is not entirely his own fault, because he didn't. The team had its limitations, but he was a popular guy, but probably not that. Never considered the best of coaches.
So let's look at the impact of this match on the Norwegian culture as a whole. What can you say about that?
I think this is one of the standout happenings in Norwegian culture, pop culture, that has been of quite a huge importance in terms of forming Norway as a nation, forming Norwegians' own self-belief, because after this game, everyone started thinking that everything was possible. As long as you are capable of beating England, you could more or less beat anyone. And it should also be mentioned that shortly after this, we started winning more games against nations that we would consider much better than us. We beat Yugoslavia a few years later on. As I already mentioned, we played against the West Germany and back in '82 in a friendly. Shouldn't put too much into that, but we still show that we were capable of giving them a match as well. And So in terms of football, it was of huge importance, but also probably even bigger in terms of um, giving Norwegians some sort of self-esteem internationally, because you can have as many great skiers and downhillers and you want, but at the end of the day, it's how your national team perform that sort of leaves a trademark outside of the borders. So you could somewhat compare it to the situation now where we have Erling Braut Haaland, who is getting the headlines every weekend all over the world. Uh, um, because this game sort of had the same effect, both back home in Norway, but also abroad. So all of a sudden, Norway was something to be reckoned with in football as well, which we hadn't been.
In the subsequent decades, have you seen examples or references of this match on the culture in terms of, let's say, art or film or just general conversation topics?
Um, can't really point to a special movie or anything like that, but it's but in terms of conversations, it never goes out of fashion. Everyone who experienced the match, everyone who was old enough to see the match, still I think holds this match at their number one spot, even though Norway later on would qualify for major tournaments and beat Brazil. And well, at some point we were considered the third best national team in the world in the early 90s. But I don't think there's any other game that stands out the same way as this game does in the consciousness of Norwegians who experienced it. Because in the 90s, when we started developing a lot of good players and the national team starting getting results and we qualified, you sort of got results more or less frequently. We just went on from one victory to another, and the occasion was never that big anymore compared to back in 81 when we faced what for most Norwegian was the biggest and best team in the world, and we managed to beat them, and it would kickstart so many other things besides football. You can if you come to a party and you don't know anyone, the safest way to sort of get things going is just to start talking about this game, for instance, and then everything goes from there on. You're just part of the company, sort of.
Yeah. So this win was not an immediate catalyst in terms of progress, and but I guess it set in motion the progress that was to arrive a decade later with Egil Olsen. And because, as you said, probably at this point in time, the players were probably somewhat limited.
Yes.
And but yeah, on a personal level, do you think this match triggered an even deeper love of the game for you?
Yes, definitely. Because I have so many fond memories of it so many years after, and even despite, as I already said, a lot of other wins by the Norwegian national team later on. I think nothing has ever compared to the excitement and post-match this game, because it still lasts sort of um, everyone who experienced it still thinks very profoundly about it, and it was you shouldn't go overboard in terms of using huge expression, but it was a truly a night for the history books, and the entire game has a mythical status in Norway, like no other football match has are able to even compete with. So most definitely, probably the most single important game ever in terms of my interest and a lot of other people's interest in football in Norway.
Yeah. You just answered my last question. So
Yeah.
yeah, I was just gonna say that. In fact, I do think it's the most important match in Norwegian football history for all the stories surrounding it and how it's looked upon like 40 years since. And
I think the short answer is
yeah,
yes. It is, because even though it would take 10, 12 years before Norwegian football became a force in Europe under Egil Drillo Olsen, this kick-started so many things that led upon the progress we made in the 90s. I think this was probably one of the last matches that made everyone feel that the Norwegian national team was a bunch of amateurs, sort of. Shortly after, Norwegian football would turn professional, and we would start picking up sporadically better results, and well, in general, the development of football from the early 80s until the early 90s was huge, and we capitalized on it. And during Egil Olsen, we produced a lot of good youngsters that he was lucky enough to be picking for his national team. They were ready when he was in charge, and they would take us on to 2 major tournaments, 3 major tournaments, and yeah. So but we wouldn't have been there without, I think, this particular experience.
with that, I'd like to thank you for this interview.
My
And
pleasure.
and I would like to remind everyone to please read the main blog article uh, for more detail. The link is included in the video upload description and along with our respective contact information. So thank you once more.
You're welcome.